Well, hi, welcome and good afternoon. My name is Sunny. I am part of the marketing team here at Crossover Health, and I would like to thank you for joining us on today's very special webinar, Healing from Racial Trauma. I'm actually going to have Dr. Roselle Jenkins introduce the topic and the presenters. Thank you.
Oh, you're on mute, Roselle.
Thank you, Liza. I was just talking. Good afternoon. Thanks for joining us. I am Dr. Jenkins, and joining us today on the panel, Dr. Riza Garcia, Dr. Shondell Clay, and Jordan Epps, licensed marriage and family therapist. We're going to be talking about healing racial trauma today. And before we begin, I'm just going to start by going over a few ground rules for the conversation today. So we hope you will stay engaged, which means that you'll just remain present and open to what you hear, even if it differs from something that you have experienced. And we know that talking about race and especially racial trauma can be uncomfortable. And even if you're the person experiencing it, it can be uncomfortable, but we hope that we will have an open dialogue that will help with the healing. We want you to speak your truth and say what is really meaningful for you, and accept that you may ask questions for which there are no answers, and you will probably have more questions than answers at the end of it, but we are just happy that you're here to begin the dialogue. Next slide, please. What we're hoping to accomplish today is to have people just identify and express the feelings that have come up for them. We know a lot of things have been happening in this country, and we want this to be an opportunity for you to talk about your feelings and ask any questions that will help move you towards the process of healing. We want to offer avenues for everyone to better understand the traumatic impact of racism on people of color, and identify avenues of support and suggestions for healing, as we know that talking and processing your feelings is one of those ways. This is why we're having this conversation. And I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Jordan.
So what I wanted to at least have us get an understanding of is the first term, racism. Intentional or unintentional acts, systems, and institutions that tolerate, accept, or reinforce unjust or inequitable treatment of others on the basis of race or skin color. Specifically, when it comes to unintentional racism, one of the things I wanted to clarify is that for unintentional racism, there are, well, it is like socially conditioned things that we may do or we may say that don't register as offensive or oppressive to us, but they absolutely are to many other people, and they can cause harm. And without a raising awareness of those unintentional, socially conditioned responses, they don't stop. So what we want to be in a better position to do is call each other on it and catching it ourselves. That's the responsibility of privilege. We also have the term anti-racism, identifying, challenging, and changing structures and behaviors that perpetrate systematic racism. And then especially for this topic or this discussion today, we're going to be going over racial trauma or race-based stress, the event or danger related to a real or perceived experience of racial discrimination. These include threats of harm and injury, humiliating and shaming events, and witnessing harm to other Black individuals or people of color. The targeted emotional injury motivated by hate or fear is a major aspect of it as well. Now I'm going to pass on to Dr. Garcia.
Thank you. And we want to acknowledge that racism does come in different forms, and author Sheila Wise Rowe has outlined some ways people can experience racism, and here are some. The most commonly understood form of racism is interpersonal, and this involves demeaning and degrading a person of color. And an example would be someone calling another person a racially derogatory name. Systemic racism is an effort to actively hamper the movement forward for people of color. It can be perpetrated in schools, medical facilities, housing, financial services, government, employment, courts, and law enforcement. More specific examples would include slavery, Jim Crow laws, separate but equal schools, and prohibitions on voting or owning land. Public space racism is where racism is communicating who is dominant, worthy, and who belongs. Examples would be Confederate Civil War statues and flags in the public areas. That's different from spatial racism, where spaces and structures are purposely designed to divide or change demographics of communities. Examples could include highways, railroad tracks, and inaccessible areas visibly separating people. Environmental racism involves the inequalities that exist in the environment. For example, the quality of air, water, and pollutants across communities are not the same. And Flint, Michigan, and the water crisis there is one huge example of that. So white privilege is the societal privilege that benefits white people over non-white people, and people of color can experience racism when white privilege is at play, and that's something we do want to acknowledge. Internalized racism is related to systemic racism and involves people of color having self-doubt, inferiority complex, powerlessness, hopelessness, or even conflict between communities of color. And colorism is also a form of internalized racism in which people of color discriminate against other people with a darker skin tone. And finally, defensive othering is related to internalized racism, and that's where people of color end up having internal conflict and attempt to join the dominant group and share the same attitudes. For example, a person of color may take on the identity of the exceptional Black person or model minority for an Asian person. And we also want to acknowledge racism can be experienced historically, across generations, personally, including through microaggressions, and vicariously, including seeing images and videos repeatedly. And we do recognize like it's not a normal experience to watch death. And that's a huge thing that's different between many years and decades ago and today, where social media is a big part of our lives now. All right, Jordan, you want to talk about the effects of trauma?
So when it comes to the effect of trauma,
or is it Jordan or Chandel?
It actually is me. Thank you, Risa. So just highlighting briefly the effects of trauma. Trauma can take many different forms. It does not show up on everyone at the same time, at the same point in time, or in the same way. And so some different effects of trauma that one might feel personally is excessive fear and anxiety. So not just the natural fear that comes with being presented with a traumatic event, which we do say that traumatic reactions are usually normal reactions to very abnormal events. So you could be experiencing normal fear and anxiety in reaction, or excessive fear and anxiety that lasts for longer than you would expect. Fatigue, feeling exhausted by the trauma, whether physically or emotionally. Having difficulty concentrating, aggression, being very reactive, whether physically aggressive, emotionally or verbally aggressive, in reaction to feeling the effects of trauma. There could be depressive symptoms, dysphoric mood, sadness, or even apathy. PTSD symptoms, this is a big one. When people experience racial trauma, even vicarious trauma by seeing images or reading stories, that can elicit PTSD symptoms in the people who have experienced that vicarious trauma, whether by flashbacks, going back to the experience of feeling like it's happening right then and there, nightmares, avoidance, disengagement, detachment, like I said before, apathy, or the other end of the spectrum, feeling hyperarousal or hypervigilance, always being on guard or on edge as though something bad is about to happen. Substance use is something that people turn to when they're trying to cope with the overwhelming emotions that they're having. Internalized evaluation, which is internalizing the messages that a person is not worthy or not valued by the greater society or by others, feeling as though they don't have any worth. That worthlessness can become internalized. An assaulted sense of self, which is where what you think you know about yourself and who you are, feels like it's being under attack or destroyed, and you start to lose your sense of self. Internalized voicelessness, which is sort of an extreme of learned helplessness, feeling like you are helpless to a situation and don't have the ability to advocate for yourself or your own safety. Relational dysfunction, which is a disturbance in the relationships you have, and then physical symptoms. It could be more pervasive, like heart disease or diabetes, certain cancers and conditions like fibroids, things that are a direct relation to, higher rates within certain racial groups because of environmental or medical racism. And then also like more personal physical symptoms like high heart rate, high blood pressure, headaches, fatigue, certain aches and pains and things like that. These are all part of the effects that trauma has on us, both individually and as groups.
So we want to open it up now for open discussion. We wanted to keep the education part light. We really want to have time and space for people to ask questions or to make a comment or so of what's been helpful, because there is a healing power in even talking. So a big chunk of this webinar is really the Q&A portion, which will start now, and then we'll have a little over half an hour to really just dive in and have people open up, or really pick our brains in terms of like, what can I do with, this situation or, with this conflict. So we do have a Q&A box. I hope you all can find it. And that's where you can begin to ask us questions. I know it can take a moment or so, but feel free to dive right in. And we'll give it a minute or so for people to start to ask questions. Or we could also open it up to something that might be helpful for all.
And then the questions can also be sent anonymously.
That's important, yes. While we're giving participants time to respond to the questions, should we talk about some of the questions we've gotten when we've talked about this previously? Because we have had some unanswered questions dealing with racial trauma.
Mm-hmm. We actually had a previous webinar called Let's Talk About Race, and in that we didn't get through all the questions, but one of the big reoccurring questions was, how do I deal with this in the workplace? So there's so much out there in the news, feeling tired, fatigued, don't know how to process it, but still having to go to work and go through it. And it's even harder when maybe other people around you might not understand what you're going through, especially if you're a minority in your org or team. I don't know if anyone has any thoughts right now initially about how someone can deal with that in the workplace.
I have a few thoughts, and it really depends on what is happening to the person. If they are just simply experiencing the fatigue of everything that's happening and anxiety, and maybe as they're working, they're wanting to talk about that, or they're wanting support from that. And maybe they're able to find that at work. There may be people that they can talk to who understand them, but if not, then my suggestion would be that you seek that support outside of work, because if you're hoping that people might understand at work, they may not, and that can feel further traumatizing if you're trying to talk to people about what you're experiencing and they don't understand it. Now, if the problem is that a person is experiencing microaggressions at work, or people are saying things that they believe are insensitive, then there are several ways to deal with that. But again, that is going to be based on the situation and how comfortable a person feels, because you can communicate what's happening, but you have to make some decisions about, okay, does it make sense for me to say something? Do I feel safe saying something? Will there be any type of retaliation if I say something? There are going to be times when you're going to decide, okay, I just need to let this go because I can't have the conversation right now. If your response to what a person is saying makes you really angry, then that's probably not the best time to address it. But if you believe that you can respond to it in a way that lets you share your feelings about what's being said, but also lets the person know that the comment was inappropriate, then I would suggest that you talk about it. But you have to be really thoughtful about that and ready to have that conversation, because it is not always an easy thing to do. So it really just depends on what a person is experiencing in the workplace.
Yeah. Thank you, Roselle. I would actually like to talk more about that while we wait for any questions or topics that participants want us to talk about, because that is one thing that came up a lot in our last webinar as far as how do I handle microaggressions at work or situations that make me uncomfortable. And so we definitely wanted to touch on that. When you have an experience in the workplace or even outside of the workplace that makes you very uncomfortable, you have three options: to either let it go, respond immediately, or respond later. And a lot of times we feel pressure to make a response either immediately or later. But we hear all the time that, you need to respond to these things. You need to address them in order for other people to learn from their, mistakes and missteps. However, letting it go and not addressing it can be really tempting for a couple of reasons, not just for the avoidance of conflict, but also because addressing offensive comments can be really emotionally draining. It's taxing to stay silent and let things go, but it's also really difficult to continue to find the energy to have these difficult conversations. And so when you go into it, if you are experiencing certain really intense emotions like anger, then it might be a good idea to let yourself calm down before you address it with a person at a later time. In private, of course, is probably the best way to go. But if it's more so confusion, then it could be better to address it immediately to give the person a chance to clarify what they meant by their comment. If you say something like, I'm not sure what you mean by that, could you explain a little bit more? That's sort of like a low pressure way to address things. And of course, you want to take into account the importance of the issue and the importance of the relationship. If the relationship with the other person is important to you, then avoidance is probably not the best approach. You want to express yourself in a way that honors your care for the other person, and also assert yourself in a way that acknowledges your concern about the issue and your respect for yourself and your own place. And then lastly, you're probably going to want to prepare yourself for some disarming comments. Disarming meaning, when we have these difficult conversations, a lot of times it comes up with people, the reaction can be very defensive. And so being able to say like, hey, I know that this is a really uncomfortable conversation, to have someone bring this to you. And also when it happened, I felt some discomfort as well. So we're in the same boat. We're just trying to, come to one accord. And so deciding all of those factors, like having that discernment, can be very difficult, but can also be pretty fruitful. So thank you so much for bringing that up.
And then to branch off what Dr. Jenkins said, one of the things she mentioned is that it can be re-traumatizing going to the same environment and expecting change to happen within the environment, and then re-traumatizing when we see the change is not happening yet. I'm not getting the results that I'm looking for. And that's an important piece because it really can impact many people. That's also one of the reasons why we still want to give everybody the understanding that there were alternative resources even outside of the workplace, whether it's seeking the community leaders, seeking spiritual support, seeking therapy, talking to friends, so that the help can get started. Because when we're waiting on the environment to change, in many cases, we're not accessing some of the resources that we have that can help us in the moment. So it's understanding that sometimes we would have to leave from that environment to actually get the help that we're looking for, which can even prepare us for when we're re-entering the environment, as opposed to getting the same intense reaction of being re-traumatized.
Chandel, you touched on the importance of knowing your emotion, what you're going through, and then responding depending on what you're feeling. So we have a really good question related to that. We have a question that says, I am a biracial person, Black and white, and often have my experiences with racism invalidated by both ethnicities. How can I express my frustration with this in a manner that will be heard and understood? And I'll open it up to the whole group. So how can you express frustration specifically, if that's what you're feeling?
I would suggest simply expressing that you are feeling frustrated, being very direct, saying that I am very frustrated, that I am expressing something that is important to me and is being dismissed or invalidated, because of course your feelings are valid. And if you're talking to people that care about you or that with whom you're in relationship, you would hope that they would understand that. Now, of course, I can't promise that everybody's going to have that reaction, because there are some people that just simply are not going to be understanding, and you have to decide how you're going to react to that. If you're going to take what those people say and let that impact how you feel about yourself, or how you respond to other people, but being very direct in expressing that I'm frustrated about this and my feelings are just as valid as anyone else's, because they certainly are.
Yeah, you brought up a good point. That even goes with this discussion. Even when it comes to trauma, many assume, well, trauma must mean I must have gone to war to experience trauma, or I have to be surrounded by death to actually experience trauma. And it's understanding that no, when it comes to the emotions that we went over on that list and the strong impact it can have, it can happen from anything, and it can happen to anybody, and that's valid. So when you're talking about your experience of something that others may not understand, I can see the frustration, because the one thing that is true is that you are still experiencing these emotions. And even though those may, invalidate it or wave it off, those emotions still exist. They're still present. And the circumstances that led up to it are as important.
There's another question. How can I be supportive to a friend or family member who is having a harder time coping with racial disparities?
That can be, go ahead, Jordan.
One of the things about when it comes down to helping others is, well, one of the base things that we're always able to do for anybody is at least be there, at least be somebody that can listen. As we talked about previously, we talked about the topic of validation. And with validation, it's not the process of agreeing or disagreeing with somebody. It's basically confirming their experience. So just letting them know that we're hearing their experience. We can see the experience that they're going through and the impact that it has. That's one of the first things that any of us as humans can do for one another.
Yeah, I definitely agree about just making space for the feelings that are coming up and validating the experiences that the person is having. If they happen to be having a harder time than you are, or if they're having experiences that are different from the ones that you are having, just making room for those differences that come up. And also, when it comes to friends and family, it can be so important to just have that support of saying that, I understand, or at least am trying to understand the experience that you're having. And I may not have, a ton of suggestions on how to fix it, how to make it better. A lot of things, especially feels like this year, are just beyond our control. There's not a whole lot we can do in order to manipulate our environment in order to make things better. But where appropriate, we can make suggestions for coping, including, talking about it. And there are two different types of coping. One is when you need to process through it, to be able to talk about the emotions that you're having, to talk through the experiences that you're having and what you can do about it. And then sometimes when it's completely overwhelming and you don't necessarily have the energy or strength for that, it might be time for distraction, of being able to talk about something else, to go do something else, to take your mind away from it. And so some examples about, more processing coping mechanisms are like talking about it, writing about it, having those sort of interpersonal connections. And then distraction might be, do you want to go, watch a movie? During this time, we're not going to the movies, but to have some time to watch a movie together, or make a suggestion that you read the book that you've been meaning to read. There's lots of different ways that you can distract yourself, because sometimes it's just too much to be wading through.
Shundell, you made a very good point about the distraction piece with the coping, because earlier earlier in this talk, we talked about people being re-traumatized by seeing all that's out there in terms of watching the videos over and over again when unarmed Black men in particular have been killed by the police, and how traumatizing that can be. And if you are just talking about that constantly or seeing that constantly, certainly you're going to feel anxiety, depression, and some of the other things. And even if you are an activist and this is what you do, you still need some time away from that. You still need time to do other things, because part of what helps us heal in any capacity, part of what makes life hopeful and optimistic for us, is engaging in things that also are joyful and that are life-giving. So it can't be all about talking about trauma and seeing trauma day in and day out. And even if you're trying to support someone, reminding them of that is a really good thing.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think it's really important to know the signs of stress and like overwhelming, the signs of being overwhelmed by stress, and knowing when you just need to disconnect and disengage. I know I've had that experience recently with what's going on in Wisconsin. I can't look at it anymore. I can't read about it anymore. I can't talk about it anymore. I need to go do something else for a while. So you have to not only know the signs of stress and racial trauma in others to recognize when others might need help or when you might need to be there for a friend, but also knowing that for yourself. What are your signs that you have hit your capacity and need to just disengage and take a break? And then give yourself permission to do that. Because I know there is a lot of pressure to stay engaged, to stay informed. We want to know exactly what's going on. If we're going to talk about these issues or debate about them, we need to know all of the facts of the situation. And so there's that pressure to just keep consuming the traumatic material over and over again to make sure that you're completely present on everything. But sometimes you just have to give yourself permission to just step away. You're not going to be able to be a productive member of trying to find solutions if you are completely tapped out.
Yeah, it's very common. It's 2020. We have access to many sources of media, but one of the things that we still have to acknowledge is that we're not trying to shy away from it, but understanding that re-exposure to death, it has its impacts on us. And we're seeing a lot of racial tensions. We're seeing a lot of deaths of different people of color, but death in general is something that comes with a heightened sensitivity. We still want to be in a position to take care of ourselves with the exposure.
And we have a question very much along the lines of what you three were already talking about. Any suggestions on speaking with my children / opening up the conversation about race with them and strengthening them with coping skills? With them being on social media, they're seeing the trauma in the community, but haven't spoken with me about it.
I would suggest beginning the dialogue with your children. If you know that they are being exposed to this, just having a talk with them about how they feel, like just asking that question, saying, I know that you're seeing a lot, you're reading a lot, we haven't talked about it, but I just want to hear your thoughts and feelings about it. And as you hear their thoughts and feelings about it, you can offer suggestions or talk about, if you feel comfortable, your experiences. But in terms of coping with it, some of the things that we're saying, maybe suggesting to your children that they limit their exposure to all that they're seeing on social media, but also talking to them about what type of support there is for them in the community. If they need to talk to someone in terms of a mental health professional, letting them know that they can talk to you anytime they have questions. I actually have a young relative in my home who was talking to me about all the things and just her feelings of hopelessness, and that things have not changed and there is no progress. And I know that many young people can feel very disenchanted when they're seeing so many things happen. And I had a conversation with her, just reminding her of, yes, things are very tough and we're seeing a lot of things, but also reminding her not just of the changes that have been made, but also the things that can can help her stay hopeful as we look at, you know, some of the things historically that people have done, the things that people in different groups of color have overcome. And I think that made her a bit hopeful, just talking about the history, because I think sometimes when people are in this point in time, they think this is all there is. And that's what makes them feel very anxious and very hopeless, because they're not looking at the entire historical context. And while it's been a long history of some very oppressive things, there also have been some positive changes that have been made. And so I encourage people to also talk about those, just because you do want to balance what is happening now with also the things that are hopeful, but also what you can do to continue to be part of the change that you want to see, because that's really important as well.
Huge fan of being in a position of being influence on the child's life, letting them know that you're available to listen to them, to talk to them, to educate. But another thing is also letting them know who their network is, letting them know who are other available resources, whether within the family, whether within the community, that they can access, because this is a time where many children are going to be trying to go to their influences to talk and get information, and just letting them know, or letting them have an understanding of what their network of support looks like.
One question that came up in the last webinar on just race in general was, how young is too young to talk to children about race-related issues anyway?
Well, research shows that I think as early as 3 or 4, and if you all know something different, I think that's what I know, kids start to have some idea about race. And if they're coming to you, which they probably will say something to you like, why is my skin different? I remember my son coming to me with those questions. You can start having those conversations with them. Just the facts, you know, it's just the facts at that age. But as they get older, you want to have more appropriate conversations on their level that they can understand. If they are experiencing people saying anything or they're feeling some way, then you have conversations about that as it comes up with them. But certainly you have to have conversations with your children about race.
Yeah, and as you mentioned, something that they can understand. Of course, at ages 3 and 4, it's going to be kind of them trying to understand, oh, what are these differences? Look at that person, they're different. Of course, this is not the opportunity to talk about death, though. That's going to be different in terms of the impact that it's going to have on the child. So trying to monitor material that's age appropriate. Of course, if you have a 9-year-old that has an understanding of the death going on, then yes, that's going to be a time to have a conversation with them about death.
Yeah. Agreed. When it comes to the negative impacts of racism and discrimination between groups, then that's going to be a conversation for older children. But children develop their racial identity, you know, very young. Like Roselle said, ages 3 or 4, possibly even 2, they're able to at least recognize this person's skin is a different color than that person's skin. Children are able to group and categorize when they're very young. And so, even at a very young age, you know, even like toddler ages, it's okay to point out that, hey, yeah, people are different. You know, you're going to meet people who are different colors than you are. And this is what this group is called. This group is called Black people or African American people, or these people with this background are called these people. You know, just being able to name it and recognize that, yes, we all look different from each other, and start to instill that idea that differences don't necessarily mean bad. It doesn't necessarily mean negative. The things that make us different from each other means that we have opportunities to learn from each other. So if you see someone who is different from you, that means that they have something that you can learn about, or they have maybe different skills and abilities that they can tell you about if you ask them nicely, you know, things like that. You can bring up with your children. I know my goddaughter is about 2.5, and she already can recognize, you know, when all the different colors and skin tones she sees around herself, and being able to color people with different crayons. If you say, you know, draw a picture of your grandmother, and draw a picture of your godmother, she knows that the crayons are going to be different. And so being able to highlight that differences are a good thing, that those are opportunities to celebrate each other. Those are opportunities to look at all of the good things that we have to learn from each other is perfectly fine.
One thing I wanted to bring up, which ties into pretty much everything we've talked about so far, is the emotion of discomfort. One of the things I've heard a lot of is it can be uncomfortable talking to my children, but it can also be really uncomfortable talking to people in the workplace about racism, especially if it's something pertaining to, like, for example, overt racism or even a microaggression. What would you three say about the feeling of discomfort?
I know one of the things I'm a fan of, especially from the clinical standpoint, is helping in instances, making the uncomfortable more comfortable. Or even when it comes to these topics, knowing it's uncomfortable is something that, because it's uncomfortable, that means I'm going to be holding it within and I'm going to be carrying it within. And when it comes to talking to others, including our children, about it, we're going to be uncomfortable talking to them, but also understanding what that means. They're going to be uncomfortable too talking about it. The ability to talk to us, the ability to talk to others in the community. So getting a chance to at least not say force ourselves to be uncomfortable, but learning ways that we can actually be more comfortable. And that can come from the support network. That can come from, talking to community. That can come from talking to a therapist, getting the tools to at least assist in making some aspects more comfortable.
I would say sometimes just recognizing you're going to be uncomfortable, and that's okay. You just walk through that. Every conversation is not comfortable. That doesn't mean you don't have it. We grow from that. And what's going on right now in our country is uncomfortable for most people, but it's also something that is necessary for, there to be growth and change, and just recognize that this is part of the process.
Yeah, I agree. A lot of times we tend to think that if it's uncomfortable, then that means that it's wrong. If a conversation is uncomfortable, that means that it's offensive or that we shouldn't be having it. And that's not necessarily true. Discomfort just means that, it's not something that we're used to. And if we only stick to things that we're used to, then we can never grow. We can never learn. And so leaning into that discomfort and taking it as a signal that this is a learning opportunity is going to be really important. And so that's one of the tips or suggestions that I've read about as far as like addressing microaggressions, is recognizing that that conversation is going to be really uncomfortable. It's uncomfortable for the person who's being called out on something they did that was offensive, even if they didn't mean for it to be. However, it was also uncomfortable for the person who had to experience it. And so you are both actually in the same boat. You're uncomfortable having to talk about it. I'm uncomfortable for having to experience it. Like, we are actually aligned on that. So how do we both get to the point where we can make the necessary changes and get back to comfort again?
Mm-hmm. As Dr. Clay said, when it comes down to uncomfortability, it's an opportunity for growth. I can do a side example about asking for a raise is uncomfortable. Asking for a promotion is uncomfortable. But it's finding the ways to grow from that experience.
I just want to let anyone watching right now that we have about like 10 minutes or so with the Q&A. So again, feel free to ask away. For now, I know one of the other questions that came up last time that I don't think we have fully addressed was, how do I cope, or how do I deal with the situation where there's more spotlights or just more attention to the Black community right now, especially with the series of events that have happened this year particularly, and also past events, past years. But when there's so much attention on like, how are you doing, or tell me more about your experience, but it's like coming from everywhere, from so many different people. How do you cope with that?
One of the first things that, at least a discussion I've had, is acknowledging that this, at least for the time being, has become the new norm. It's been, I mean, many have gone through their own experience of it's a topic that might come up for a little bit and then it goes away. But it's understanding that since I think it was it May? Since May, this has become a norm. having this people bringing up this discussion, having this be a topic on the media and television, it hasn't gone away. So the first thing is accepting that this is the norm, because many of us feel, let me just wait it out, it'll go away, then I can come out the shell. And it's adapting to a different world where it's going to be uncomfortable getting sources of support, getting questions over and over again about this. And that's going to put us in a position where, A, we're going to be able to, kind of identify these different ways that others are trying to support and see how we can work with them. And the other thing is it's putting us in position to kind of talk more about our boundaries and be assertive about how to implement boundaries with others, especially because being re-exposed to these questions over and over again can be very overwhelming for many. And seeing how can I exert my boundaries in this new world that we're in right now, so that I can continue on with working, with taking care of family, with going around the community.
You make a very good point about the boundaries. It's okay to say, thank you for your concern, but I don't want to talk about this right now. Just communicating directly, that's fine. I've had clients say to me that sometimes at work, people will want them to talk about their experiences and they don't necessarily feel comfortable with that. And so we just talk about, how do you say, no, I would rather not share that, because for any person of color, it's really not it's not your responsibility to educate other people. If you want to do it, fine, but it's certainly not your responsibility. And it can put an undue burden on people who have been traumatized, and just being able to say, I'd rather not, that's absolutely fine to do that.
Agreed. That has been a muscle that has been flexed over the last couple of months. And thankfully, the people who are in my circle have been able to hear when I say, like, I'm kind of overwhelmed with this topic. I really just don't have the bandwidth to talk about it right now. And people may respect that, they may not. Whether they get it is not really relevant. It's just a matter of being able to say, like, I don't want to talk about that right now. Or I'm not in the headspace to talk about that right now, or I don't have the emotional bandwidth to talk about that right now. And you may want to talk about it later, or you may not want to talk about it at all. Either one is perfectly fine to be able to accept.
We'll spend the last 6 minutes or so, again, continue to open up for questions, but I wanted to ask you three as well, if there's anything that you think we haven't touched base on that you think would be important for all of us to hear, to discuss.
Well, one thing about trauma, I know we're going to get into after this Q&A a little bit more about kind of the resource of what we can do, but in particular, just highlighting once again that we are in a time where many of us are being exposed over and over again to traumatic images. And it's kind of similar to the discussion that I've had with colleagues before, even when it came down to COVID, being in a position to limit the amount of material that we're having come in, especially when it comes to graphic videos, understanding that, yes, user discretion is advised on some of these graphic images that we're exposing ourselves to, and understanding that as a response to the graphic images or graphic videos or graphic material that we're getting exposed to, it is very normal to experience symptoms of trauma after being exposed to that material.
Absolutely. And just quickly want to touch base on the question from a while back about the person who said that they were biracial and feel like they get invalidated depending on which identity they're relating to in the moment. I don't know what it's like to be biracial, but I do know what it's like to be a very fair-skinned person. And because colorism is definitely a thing, I've had to, over time, learn how to use the privilege that I do have in moments where I feel very disempowered. So while it's important to make the space for all of the feelings and emotions that come with being a marginalized person with that identity, drawing on those experiences that come with having a privileged identity, whether it's financial privilege of being able to donate to different places, occupational or educational privilege, like the kind that we have here, to be able to do this kind of event on a widespread platform. Being able to use your light skin privilege when you are able to speak to people who are of a darker hue. Whatever you are able to draw on that can make you feel, in a place of empowerment where you're able to do something to stave off that helplessness and the hopelessness that comes with being oppressed, to be able to use that wherever you can. And that is something that I find to be really helpful.
One of the things that I think is important to remember is that whatever you're feeling or experiencing, that it's valid. That's what I would want people to remember. So if you are feeling like, I don't want to hear this, that's okay. If you want to go out there and you want to do something, you want to go protest or donate or whatever it is, whatever your response is, that's valid. People often feel guilt, like that's a feeling that comes up, like, oh, maybe I'm not doing enough, or maybe I need to do more, or if I just want to disengage from it all. It's okay. It's okay for you to take care of yourself. It's okay for you to take time for yourself and step away, like whatever your response is as a result of this. Just be okay with that.
Anything else? So anyone wants that? Oh, there's one here. It says, I'm grateful you're having this conversation. I have friends who felt a lot of trauma after 9/11 being brown and with COVID being Asian. So connecting with people of color has helped. And I feel that people are open to talking. Well, thank you for that comment. And I think the one thing to remember is we'll talk about what will be helpful moving forward. And I mentioned at the beginning that there is power of healing in talking, but there is a difference between just talking and then like some kind of like re-traumatization happens versus talking in a productive way. So we'll talk about things like going to therapy, going to friends and family, but who you talk to and how they are receptive and respond back to you is also important. But sometimes we talk to people and then we can get invalidated or dismissed, or the person's not really there empathizing or really listening to you. So I do just want to put out there that the type of talking, the type of support is important.
There's also instances where we'll talk to someone about a trauma and they'll respond with telling us more about their traumas. That can even be more re-traumatizing.
Mm-hmm. And it can take some time to try to find the right or best support, but it is time worth it. It is worth trying to find like who is going to be there to truly be there of support, rather than just laying it out there and then again you feel even worse afterwards.
Yeah, and I'll be honest, even one of the uncomfortable, let's be honest, for many it's going to be uncomfortable, is understanding that there's even mental health providers that are available. And it's not very comfortable to meet a stranger and get a chance to talk about concerns going on. But it's also one of the opportunities we're talking about for growth, the ability to get assistance outside of that bubble, especially if it's helpful. Because for many of us, let's be honest, many people do have, in some cases, a solid support, whether it's in a community, whether it's with friends, whether it's with spiritual leaders, with family, they have the support. But it's not something that all of us are afforded. We may have them, but do they listen? Do they give appropriate help? So just wanted to talk again about how even accessing support outside of the bubble can be very uncomfortable.
For the sake of time, I do want to transition to Roselle, who'll talk about, well, what can we do moving forward, or something that we can continue doing. And thank you for everyone who has provided comments and questions. Oh, you're on mute, Roselle.
Me and this mute button. Some of these things we will have talked about, but I do want to reiterate them. So in coping with racial trauma, one of the things that is important is recognizing the signs of racial trauma. Some of the things that we talked about, if you're feeling anxious, you're feeling hypervigilant, you may be feeling feelings of sadness, having difficulty not thinking about these things, then recognize that you may need assistance. So just having that awareness of what's going on. Seeking support, something that's been mentioned throughout this webinar, friends, family, religious leaders, you might need a therapist, practicing self-care and engaging in activities that bring you joy and recharge you. That is really, really important. You might not think it, but that is a form of resistance, just staying hopeful in the midst of all of these things that are meant to oppress you or bring you down. You certainly want to connect with those things that make you feel good. And that could include mindfulness. It may include some spiritual practices. It might include affirmations or mantras, whatever you need to do to get you back to that place of feeling hopeful and moving forward. Another thing that can help you cope is just acting with agency, and that can include engaging in activism. We talked a little bit about that, setting boundaries with situations that may trigger you, whether it's at work or personally. It could be social media, as we talked about, limiting your exposure to social media or conversations with particular people. It could be not watching the news as frequently. And then it may also include communicating assertively and effectively. And we gave some examples of how to do that when you may be experiencing microaggressions or different things at work, but just being able to communicate your truth in a way that is helpful to you and to others. And I'm going to pass it off, I believe, to Shondell.
You're on mute.
Sorry. These are a list of resources that we have compiled. Hopefully they will be helpful to you guys. Things to read. These are books that you can read, podcasts that you can listen to, places where you can donate from the Black Lives Matter organization, Equal Justice Initiative, Equal Justice Society, which is based in Oakland, so it's local. And then one thing that we do want to highlight is the Liberate app, which is an app that has meditations for Black, Indigenous, and people of color. There are some free meditations on there, and then further meditations that you can have with the paid app that are very affirming and just really validating. Meditations that you can have anywhere from like 10 to 30 minutes when you just feel like you need some affirmation. And so hopefully these are resources that will help in moments where you need to be empowered, comforted, validated, any of the gamut that we can run. And then here are additional resources like blogs, briefs, things that you can read, and information that you can consume to gain more knowledge about the issue and further courageous actions that you can take in order to address what we are going through together as a nation.
There's a question. Will the slides listing the resources be available after the call?
Teresa, yeah, I'll go ahead and take care of that. Yeah, so we will be posting the recording, and then we'll try to get the resources up there also. So if you go to the crossoverhealth.com website, and if you just scroll all the way down, you'll see a tab of all the services that we offer. If you click behavioral health, it should be up there by the end of the week, if not Monday or Tuesday of next week. And then you can also find the first part of this conversation that we had, where we kind of opened up the discussion, and you could find that all over there. If you have any questions, you could also email info@crossoverhealth.com, and then we could definitely get it to you through that also. Cool, awesome. Well, thank you so much to the panel. Very informative, very touching conversation that we had. And then for everybody watching at home, thank you so much for joining. Any last minute questions, or to the panel, any last minute comments that you guys would like to make? No, so I have a few minutes here, so feel free.
I'm glad that we are having this conversation, and for the people that are watching or that watch it later, I would just say, continue having the conversations. That's actually the slide that's on the screen right now, but it is an important conversation, and take your time away when you need to, but I would suggest, rather than avoiding the conversation, which I think, we've all done at times because we need to do that, I would suggest that when you need to have this conversation, that you have it, even if it's uncomfortable, to push through it.
And that we can easily go through feeling, oh, I shouldn't be feeling this way. It's not a big deal that I'm feeling this way. Others have felt worse if they feel this way, so it shouldn't be that big compared to others. The one thing I would have you take away from this is that if you're feeling something and you're feeling something strong, yes, it can be addressed. And it may be uncomfortable with oneself, but there's help out there. And if there's anything I want you to take away from this presentation, it's knowing that there's help out there, especially even the mental health resources that you guys can access if you need help with this.
Absolutely. You deserve to take care of yourself just as much as anybody else does. So do what you need to do in order to get through this time, to come out the other side better and stronger, and try not to feel too much guilt and shame about taking care of yourself. We're just doing what we need to do.
Awesome. Well, thank you very much, Team Marisa. I believe you had one more thing to say.
I was going to clarify, Cindy, will there be a survey after this webinar?
Yes, there will be. So once you guys leave the webinar, the survey is going to automatically pop up. Feel free to share your thoughts and your feelings. Marisa, anything else to add to that?
Well, very much along that line. So because there's a survey and along the lines of people being empowered, we want to empower you to speak up about like what you think might be helpful for you, because that's what we're here for, right? Like you come to us for help, but we also want to collaborate instead of just throw stuff at you. You're very much a part of your experience. You are the set of experiences. So feel free to share any thoughts, feelings, concerns, questions, comments. We're here.
Awesome, thank you. And then yes, if you're a Crossover Health member, you can feel free to schedule with anybody from our team. The whole Crossover member family is here to help you out. So you can always open up the conversation with any of our providers. Thank you very much for joining, and thank you very much to our panel.